All right, colleagues. Yes, so today we're looking at the degree of operating leverage. This basically tells us how a change in sales affects operating income. So, operating income, this is the profit before interest and taxes. Okay. If you remember in the financial statements, you've got sales. When you take away your variable costs, you remain with your contribution. After you take away your fixed costs, that's when you get your operating income, which is the profit before interest and taxes. So before you deduct interest and taxes, that's the operating income which we are talking about. So that operating income can be affected by a change in sales in a company. So I want to read this question here, and we're going to see how this we can interpret the degree of operating leverage and what we can and how it works, so that we can be able to make decisions for the firm as the economist, right? Because remember, economics is all about making decisions on how you allocate resources. So we've got two firms in the same industry. They sell their product at 10 kwacha per unit. But one firm has a total fixed cost of 100 kwacha and an average variable cost. This is the variable cost for each unit of 6 kwacha. While the other has a total fixed cost of 300 and an average variable cost of 3.3. So find the degree of operating leverage for the second than for the first firm. I think this is a typing error. It maybe says for the first and second firm. All right. We find the degree of operating leverage for both firms. And then why is the degree of operating leverage at Q60 greater? Why is the degree of operating leverage greater at Q60 than at Q70? So as we can see, the formula for the degree of operating leverage is the contribution divided by the operating income. In other The other formulas that you can use, I prefer to use this one. All right. So let's first get the information about our firms. So for firm one, we say the total fixed costs 100, average variable cost 6 kwacha. Firm two, total fixed costs 300, average variable cost 3.3 kwacha. Right. So what I'm going to do first, we're going to calculate the degree of operating leverage for both of these firms when their quantities are at 60 and when the quantity is at 70. And after we've done those tabulations, I'm going to show you how this degree of operating leverage works. We're going to see its relationship, especially with fixed costs, relationship with variable costs, because this degree of operating leverage has a relationship with both the fixed and the variable costs. Okay, so let's get our calculators ready. So for frame one, we say at Q equals 60, when we produce 60 units, right? So the degree of operating leverage, as we said, is the contribution over the operating income. So we can break it down like this: P, the price, minus the average variable cost. This gives us the contribution per unit. Right? The price per unit, okay, we've got the price per unit and the average variable cost per unit. So when we subtract these two, it gives us our per unit contribution. Then if you want to get the overall contribution, you multiply it by the quantity. Okay. This which I've written here is the contribution, right? This is how this formula has come about. The selling price per unit minus the average variable cost per unit, that gives you the contribution per unit. Then if you want to get the total contribution, you multiply by the number of units divided by, as I said, the operating income comes when you subtract the fixed costs from the contribution. All right. So here, this P minus ABC times Q, which is above there, this is the contribution, minus the total fixed costs. This will give us our operating income. Okay, colleagues? It's the same formula I've shown here, the contribution over operating income. So since we've been given the selling price per unit and the average variable cost per unit, that's why I put P minus ABC, which will give the contribution per unit. And if you want to get the overall contribution, you multiply by the quantity. And then if you want to get the operating income, you subtract the total contribution from the total fixed costs. I hope we are okay there. If you've got any questions, please ask. Okay, so let's get our calculators ready. So we're calculating the degree of operating leverage for the first firm, firm one. Okay, this is for firm one. So the selling price per unit is 10 kwacha. The average variable cost per unit for firm one is 6 kwacha. The quantity of units, 60 units. Divided by minus our fixed cost. So the fixed cost for firm one is 100 kwacha. So let's get our calculators, colleagues. 10 minus 6, that is 4. 4 kwacha is the contribution per unit. If you remember, contribution, this is the money used to cover your fixed costs. Okay. So 10 minus 6, that is 4. 4 times 60, that is 240. Divided by this same tabulation here, we get 240. 10 minus 6 times 60, you get 240 minus 100. So we get 240 over 140. Okay, 240 divided by 140, what did we get? 1.7. That's our degree of operating leverage. So what this means, what this 1.7 means is that if sales increase or decrease by 1%, if sales increase or decrease by 1%, our operating income is going to either increase or decrease by 1.7%. So let me type that down here. What this is telling us is that if sales increase by 1%, our operating income increases by 1.7%. If sales decreases by 1%, our, our operating income also decreases by 1.7%. That's how you interpret the number that you get when you do your calculations. All right. So our degree of operating leverage is 1.7, meaning if sales increase by 1.7, if sales increase by 1%, operating income increases by 1.7%. And if sales decrease by 1%, operating income is going to decrease by 1.7%. I hope we are okay with that. Any questions? Okay, let's go to frame 2 with a quantity of 60 units. Now, one thing I also need you to remember here is that frame 2 has got higher fixed costs. It has a higher fixed cost and a lower variable cost. Okay. Frame 2 has a higher fixed cost than frame 1 and a lower variable cost than frame 2. Because I'm going to first highlight the relationship with degree operating leverage and fixed costs. Okay, we're going to compare the two frames. And what we're going to see is that if you have higher fixed costs, you have a higher degree of operating leverage. Okay, so let's get the DOL of frame 2. So using this same formula here, our selling price per unit is 10 kwacha. Our average variable cost per unit is 3.3 kwacha multiplied by our quantity, which is 60. So here, this is going to give us our contribution here, divided by minus 300. Okay, so let's 10 minus 3.33. 6.67 times 60 200.2 400.2. Okay, over 400.2 minus 300. What value do we get? 100.2. So 400.2 divided by 100.2. 400.2 divided by 100.2. 3.99. So what this means is if sales increase by 1%, the operating income of this company is going to increase by 3.99%. And if sales decrease by 1%, the operating income of this company would decrease by 3.99%. So the first thing that I need us to realize here is that if you have higher fixed costs, as you can see, firm 2 has higher fixed costs than firm 1. So if you have high fixed costs, you have a high degree of operating leverage. Okay. So anytime, even when you're calculating the degree of operating leverage for any firm, if you see it's got a high degree of operating leverage, you should know that in its cost, in that firm's cost structure, there are high fixed costs. Okay, the fixed costs are higher than the variable costs. All right. Any questions before we move further? Because we need to compare now at when the quantity reaches 70, when we increase the quantity from 60 to 70, and there it's going to illustrate to us the relationship between the degree of operating leverage and the variable costs. So for now, what I need you to remember is fixed costs and degree of operating leverage, they have a positive relationship, meaning if one goes up, the other goes up. If one goes down, the other goes down. That's what I need you to remember for here. So now let's see when we increase the quantity, okay, for firm 1 and firm 2. Okay. So we see when we say Q, we increase quantity from 60 units to 70 units. So we just put the same information, price minus average variable cost times quantity, which is contribution divided by contribution minus the total fixed cost, which gives us operating income. So again, our selling price per unit is 10 kwacha. Average variable cost per unit is 6 kwacha. Now remember this, colleagues, when your quantity increases, also your average variable costs increase, right? So remember, keep that in mind. When your quantity increases, also your average variable costs increase. So 10 minus 6 times 70. 10 minus 6 times 70 divided by 10 minus 6 times 70. Minus 100. So let's get our calculators. So 10 minus 6, that is 4. 4 times 70, that is 280. Divided by 280 minus 100. So we're going to get 180. 280 divided by 180. What is 280 divided by 180? 1.55. 280, 180, 1.55. So if we look at frame 1 at Q60, okay, when Q was 60, we had the degree of operating leverage of 1.7. Now, when Q was 60, we had a DOL of 1.7. Then Q becomes 70, we have a DOL of 1.55. So what's happening here is the variable costs. Remember, when we produce 60 units and we multiply it by our average variable cost per unit, 60 times 6, our variable costs were 360 kwacha. Now, when we increase quantity to 70 units, it was 70 times 6. The average variable cost is 420. So here, what you're supposed to remember, colleagues, is the degree of operating leverage and the variable costs have an inverse relationship. So when your variable costs go up, the degree of operating leverage is going to go down. Well, here it's just gone down by a small amount, but if you increase the quantity, you keep on increasing, you see the degree of operating leverage, you start going smaller and smaller and smaller. So let's prove this again with frame 2. We're going to compare frame 2 when it produces 60 units and when it produces 70 units. Which one will have a higher degree of operating leverage? And again, we're going to see that as the variable costs increase due to an increase in quantity, your degree of operating leverage goes down, which is answering this part of the question is why the DOL at Q60 is greater than at Q70. This is the part of the question that we're answering here. So for frame 2, producing 70 units, DOL 10 minus 3.33 times 70 over 10 minus 3.33 multiplied by 70 minus 300. All right, colleagues. 10 minus 3.33 is 6.67. 6.67 times 70. 6.67 times 70. 466.9 and 466.9 minus 300. Okay, then 466.9 divided by 166.9. Two 2.797. So as you can see also here again, if we compare for frame 2, when the quantity was 60 units, our degree of operating leverage was 3.99. Now we've increased quantity to 70 units. So our variable costs have increased. And when the variable costs increase, we notice the degree of operating leverage has reduced to 2.97. So here the fundamental thing that you must remember is the degree of operating leverage measures how a change in sales affects a change in operating income. A high degree of operating leverage, it means if there's any change in the sales in that company, a big increase or a even a small increase or a big decrease, the operating income is going to be affected. All right. And then the relationship between degree of operating leverage and fixed costs. As we can see here, if we compare frame 1 and frame 2, right? Frame 2 has the higher fixed costs, and you can see in both occasions, frame 2 has a higher degree of operating leverage than frame 1. As you can see, frame 2 has the higher fixed costs and lower variable costs, but it's exhibiting a higher degree of operating leverage than frame 1 at both quantities. So a higher fixed costs, higher degree of operating leverage. Okay, there is a positive relationship between the two. Fixed costs and degree of operating leverage. There's a positive relationship. Then when it comes to variable costs, there's an inverse relationship with degree of operating leverage and the variable costs. As you can see, when we look at frame 1, and the quantity is 60, the degree of operating leverage is 1.7. When we increase the quantity, meaning also our variable costs increase, we see a drop in the degree of operating leverage. Similar with frame 2. At 60 units, the degree of operating leverage is 3.99. When we increase the number of units that we produce, meaning also our variable costs increase, we see a drop in the degree of operating leverage. And finally, how you interpret this, for example, this 3.99 here, what it's telling us is that if there's a 1% increase in sales for frame 2, there will be a 3.99% increase in operating income. And if there's a 1% decrease in sales, there's going to be a 3.99% decrease in operating income.